Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to Face the State here on the Montana Television Network. I'm Jay Cohn, your host this morning. We have an exciting program for you and I hope you'll stick with us for the full half hour. Today our topic is a new documentary that aired in Montana just last night here on the MTN network and debuted at the Fort Peck Community College on Thursday of this week. The documentary, produced by Newsy, one of our Scripps company investigative units, is entitled A Broken Trust. It's really about how the federal government has failed repeatedly to protect Native women from sexual assault in America. It also focuses on the continued underfunding of tribal justice systems, limiting the tribe's authority to prosecute and sentence sexual offenders. Let's introduce you to our panel this morning. We have three of the producers of this awesome documentary that I watched this week and kind of was just awestruck. Next to me, we have Maren Mackless, one of the producers. Maren, good to see you and have you back in Montana today. Yeah. Carrie Cochran is in the middle here, one of the photographers and did a lot of the videography work on this documentary. And last but certainly not least, we have Angela Hill, also all with Newsy. So, Maren, you're close to me. Let's talk about how this documentary happened. You say this goes back a couple of years.
Yeah. So I had initially heard about, the rates of sexual assault that are perpetrated against Native American women and wanted to investigate that more. So I brought it to the team and we decided to really dig into the topic and kind of figure out what are the reasons that these statistics are persisting and what is being done about it. There's a lot of responsibility on the federal government to kind of help protect tribal nations. So what was their part in that? What are the tribes doing? And so we just went into the field and started pulling this story apart, gathering handwritten documents, talking to sources, getting close with the community, and just trying to figure out what was happening, what are the main contributors to this problem.
Carrie, you have a long history in journalism, basically in the Cincinnati area. How did you get hooked up with Newsy and with this project?
So I guess before I came, I had done some extensive reporting on the opioid crisis in Cincinnati and really trying to get into that community and understand some of the issues, a lot of which were misunderstood, a lot of stigma. And so there were some correlations to this story. I'm really driven to figure out issues that are happening, but going and seeing sort of the human effects of these issues. And so this project really aligned with that.
Angela, how about yourself? When they came to you or you came to them and said, I'd like to be part of this, how did all that happen?
Yeah, first I just knew there was an awesome opportunity. This is such an important topic to really be able to unpeel the layers of it and really bring some strong reporting, investigative reporting to it. I've had the great pleasure and also the difficult pleasure as well to have reported on sexual assault throughout my career, a number of different stories when I was first working with ABC News out of New York. So I know how important this topic is, and really to be able to cover this particular community because it's often forgotten, right? And this is a topic that not just impacts this community, but impacts the nation. And so I thought it was an awesome opportunity to be a part of this phenomenal team and really dig deep and see what exactly is going on here.
In case our viewers didn't have a chance to catch this last night on the Montana Television Network, we have a little trailer to give you a taste of the documentary A Broken Trust.
Native women have told me that what you do when you raise a daughter is you prepare her for what to do when she's raped, not if, but when.
I don't have so much hurt now as opposed to anger. Justice wasn't served, in my opinion.
There's been this patchwork of laws. If one agency drops the ball, the whole house of cards falls.
Pretend it wasn't there and maybe it will go away, but it continues.
Why are we different than every other person? Why don't we have the justice everybody else does?
You are failing these people.
It's hard to be a police officer here. Who else is going to be here to be somebody else's hope?
That's just a taste of A Broken Trust And trust me, once you start watching this, you're not going to want to turn this off. Let's talk about how you picked Fort Peck, the reservation in Montana, and how you also focused on Fort Berthold?
Yeah.
Berthold in North Dakota. Excuse me if I didn't pronounce that exactly right, because I should know that. But how did you end up in Montana? And you said you spent 7 weeks here over the last several years.
So we had spent a lot of time speaking with national experts about, where they felt like this problem was really happening, where would be a good place to kind of look at the prevalence and, all of the different contributing factors to it. And, we had spent some time, we went up to the Pacific Northwest, we went to Oregon, we went to Washington,
Idaho.
we went to Idaho, we went to Montana, and then we went to North Dakota. And I think the main thing for us was, at first we were kind of focusing on the oil boom and how that had impacted these communities with the influx of workers, the influx of drugs. We had heard that, with the oil boom, there was an influx of drugs and human trafficking. And so we really wanted to hone in on places that had a lot of examples of that. And so we went to Fort Peck, and there seemed to be a genuine interest from the community to figure out what the problems were that were contributing to this, and that they wanted answers as well. And so I think that was important to us that, we had buy-in from the community. They wanted us to be there, and they wanted us to examine this issue. And same thing with Fort Berthold. There were some council members who really fought for us to be there and wanted us to examine this issue and gave us access to documents and data, and so that's kind of how we focused on those areas.
It had to be a big thing in that you had a Native American reporter with you who had roots in the Native American world, and that helped build some trust, because that is a big challenge for people coming off the reservation trying to focus on things. There is a distrust there. Carrie, can you talk about that?
Sure, yes. Suzette Brewer, she is a member of the Cherokee Nation and also is really an expert in federal Indian law. And so not only does she understand some cultural things that maybe people from the communities wouldn't understand, but she also brings this vast knowledge of even how to deal with tribal governments, how to make sure that everyone is aware of the story that we're going for, and then just bring an expertise in federal Indian law is very complicated. Even lawyers who study law for years and years don't understand it. So she just brought a lot to our team.
Yeah, it was interesting actually when we were trying to find an expert to help us kind of break down all of these different laws, because we ended up finding out that it wasn't just one particular thing that was contributing to this. It was a whole, it's our entire history as a nation, and the development of governments and federal government and tribal government interrelationships. And so we were trying to talk to different experts, and it almost seemed like no one was able to talk about everything that we wanted them to talk about. So we were very fortunate to find Sarah Deer, who's an incredible expert in this subject, in sexual violence on tribal lands and federal Indian law as well, who was able to, you saw her in the trailer, she was able to kind of break things down for people.
Angela, how you mentioned about peeling off the layers, and there's multiple layers involved here. That had to be a huge challenge, because when you're talking about an audience, you have to start at square one and explain how did that all unfold, because there's so many layers to this.
Yeah, well, I would first say again that Suzette Brewer, the journalist that we worked with, she was awesome. But even having her on a team, there were still certain protocols that we had to go before. I think it was the first time that any of us had been before a tribal council to actually say, this is why we're here and this is what we're looking to do, both at Fort Peck, and we were able to also do the same at Fort Berthold, talking with the council member there, who then put us in front of the chairman. But it requires a lot of trust, building that trust up front, letting them know that we're here to really report a story fairly and accurately. And peeling those layers back takes time. It takes digging through documents. It takes talking to a whole host of people. There are so many people who are so generous with their time with us, with their expertise, with their resource that didn't make the piece, but still helped inform our reporting. And so that's why it took us so long to really peel back this story, because we wanted to be very careful. There was also the layer of dealing with the federal government, dealing with the Department of Justice, and being able to approach them repeatedly. Sometimes that took some time to be able to get the information and the data that we needed to really help pull this entire story together from the Native American community and also from the Department of Justice federal side.
Yeah.
Talk about some of the characters that really drive this this documentary. There's a tribal judge at Fort Peck. There's a police officer from Fort Peck, a couple of them. Also another police officer, a lady over from Fort Berthold. And talk about, because I think they're putting their necks out on the line here, because this is an issue that you don't talk about over the dinner table. I think that was one of the points made, that a lot of this is kind of swept under the rug. Tell us about those characters and individuals that people will meet during this documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all were incredibly impacted by the people that we met in these communities. We had a very interesting experience where we would just go to, an agency and be like, we're working on this story. Can you help us find X? And someone that we would talk to would just be like, oh, you're working on a story about this? Like, I was a survivor. I went through this.
Right.
And so I think that in the community, it's it's not something that's generally talked about, but it is something that a lot of people have connections to. So I think people were willing to, speak up and say something about what was going on, because they felt like maybe it could help and maybe it would make more people come forward. And yeah, I mean, I think all of the people that were willing to speak with us are incredibly brave for the stories that they shared. And, they are there every single day, putting their best foot forward and trying to, as Alicia says, because if they're not there, who else will be there? So they kind of take it upon themselves to be there for the community. And I think they felt like it was kind of a duty to speak out about this.
And I also think there's something to be said about some of the officials, right, who had to come forward and admit that, hey, we're not doing as well as we should be doing. And that takes a lot of courage, takes a lot of honesty to be able to sit down with us. We're showing them documentation, asking them the tough questions of why do these records say what they do, and why do they not say what they're supposed to say, right? And so you have a Captain Grace from Fort Berthold who said, hey, maybe I could be doing a better job. And you have Councilwoman Mayer who's like, yeah, this is a problem and we need to do better. We're failing our own people. And so, it takes a level of courage and commitment for leadership to say, hey, we've got to do something about this. And so in addition to the powerful stories that we heard of women, for survivors who are really fighting to try to make their lives better, to try to make the community better, you've got leadership who's also, sort of like their feet are being put to the fire, saying, hey, okay, we've got to do better.
Was it Captain Grace that said, I don't know the answers to your question, but it told me I need to buckle down here and find the answers, and she did. Yeah, so that was very powerful. Some of the quotes that jumped out at me, and there's a bunch of people reciting their experiences, but one said, it's Native girls are the target, not if you're sexually assaulted, but what to do when you're sexually assaulted. That was one that just jumped out at me. Some of the statistics: more than half of Native women will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. Half of them, more than half. And then the other one that just kind of grabbed me by the throat was the lady that said, I can't think of another person, another Native woman who I know that hasn't experienced this in their lifetime. And when you heard that, Carrie, what was your response? It just kind of takes you aback.
Right. It really was, I guess, one of the things that when we were there, we were like, this is why we are here. We weren't exactly expecting to encounter so many people that were willing to tell us their stories. A lot of people weren't willing to go on camera for obvious reasons.
Right.
This it's a very sensitive subject. There's also still a lot of stigma involved in speaking about it. There are people who told us about their sexual assault, but also told us that they hadn't yet told their husband. There are people who told us, we can't speak out, I can't speak out about this right now, but I'm so glad that you guys are here. Thank you for being here because it is time. And that's what it felt like, that we met so many brave, strong women who said, like, it is time that something is done about this. Some of whom had already been trying to do stuff for the community, like Judge Smith, who left Fort Peck to get her law degree, left her young children, came back to make sure that more that the tribal court could have a little bit more sentencing after the federal government has limited tribal court sentencing.
Right.
And so time after time, again, it was, sometimes we weren't sleeping at night because you're constantly thinking about what it must be like to live through this, but also you feel like very convicted that this is why we're here.
And this is well worth it. They call it the shame event in their society amongst the women, and that's many of the big reasons that they haven't shared it with their husband or even with anyone else in their family. That just, you kind of just, I shook my head when I heard that.
Yeah, and I think it's the case for anyone across this country who has experienced sexual assault. There is a level of shame that comes with that, unfortunately. And I think what makes this community a little bit more unique is that it's a lot of times the communities are much smaller, right? And so there's a greater chance that you're going to actually run into your perpetrator, right? So that might be different if you're living in a bigger city, you've been sexually assaulted, the chances of you seeing your perpetrator might be slim. But when you're in these small, tiny communities, and so the shame is even greater, and it makes it even more difficult to come forth and say this happened to me. And so I think we have to sort of kind of put that in context, right? Every victim of sexual assault, I think it's safe to say, is going to experience that level of shame. But when you're right there and you're seeing your perpetrator every day, you're going to the grocery store and seeing them, or you're going to a sporting event and seeing them, it makes it very difficult.
And I think, go ahead,
also,
Carrie.
I would also add to that as we saw in the film, as we uncovered, the criminal justice system really isn't doing as much to protect these women and children. And so what that means is when you are sometimes literally, we talk to people who their perpetrator was right across the street from them, and every morning they would walk out and they would have to see their perpetrator, and there was a fear. And so if you, not only has this person done this violent act towards you, but then if you speak up, that person's going to be not very happy with you. And so there's an element of danger, actually, because these women aren't being protected.
I got a sense of that watching the documentary, the danger that's there. The police officer that's driving down the alley telling the kids, you need to get back, the curfew is here for your help. We're not just being jerks making you go home. There is real danger here on the streets and in the back alleys.
And I would say also that I think, the statistics bear that out, right? If you look at Fort Berthold, where you have, I think over a course of maybe 6 years, was it? There were like 3 cases that actually were prosecuted.
Right.
And of those cases, they only received anywhere from 3 months to 3 days to 6 months. I mean, it's hard to know that I can come forward and report this when all someone's going to get is 3 days or 6 months after the type of crime that they've perpetrated. So it's very difficult, and the system doesn't make it easy for women or other victims to come forward and report the crimes.
Let's talk about that system, because I think our viewers are going, what do you mean the perpetrator's right across the street, walking the streets? Well, it's this maze of jurisdictional, a big mess, I'll just call it, between the tribal government, the federal government, the local tribal court, and explain to our viewers a little bit about how that, there's a sentencing cap if the tribal court takes prosecute a case. 1 year is the max they can give, or a $5,000 fine. there is an enhanced sentencing, but as your documentary points out, only a handful of the tribal courts around the country have chosen to take that.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's incredibly complicated, as you mentioned. There is, because the federal government has this trust responsibility to provide protection and provide for the well-being of tribal members, there is kind of this weird relationship between the tribes and the federal government. So the federal government essentially decides everything that is supposed to be happening locally. So they make laws, the federal government makes laws and cap sentencing. They also make it so that tribes can't prosecute non-native perpetrators as well. And I think that there's also a lot of confusion when it comes to jurisdictional issues. You know, the federal government is supposed to be there to help investigate and prosecute crimes. Sometimes it's the state government, which we don't even get into in this film, and it goes reservation by reservation as well. But you have, like, from the federal government, lots of laws and policies that are coming down in a blanketed fashion when there's all of these different circumstances on all these different reservations. So it can get really complicated to the point where even law enforcement doesn't know what they're supposed to be doing, and they don't know if they have jurisdiction over someone in one area or in another area. It just gets incredibly complicated, and so the federal government has all of these different laws that restrict tribal authority, and so that's the reason why Judge Smith left the reservation to go get her law degree, to come back and try and have sentencing pass 1 year to be 3 years. Unfortunately, that law has not been used, as you find out in the documentary, for any sexual assaults.
The other thing I'll say is there's laws, but also, as Marin alluded to, this trust responsibility where a lot of this is missing from our history books. The special relationship that the federal government has from the tribes, going back to when
the first
tribal nations, tribal nations were pushed off lands, and in exchange, the federal government said, "Hey, we promise we'll take care of you." And so, what that has meant is that the federal government, is responsible for funding tribal courts, for funding tribal law enforcement, and they are not fulfilling their promise.
Well, 5% of what's been asked for is basically what they've been getting over the years. 5% what they request. And so this continued constant underfunding has, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not going to succeed because there just isn't the resources to make it succeed. Just you point out at the Fort Peck, the tribal law enforcement there is down 9 positions, and that was just during your documentary, and that felt like the officer felt pretty good about that. That might have been their high point. So this is just not here in Montana, but all across Native America. They're dealing with this underfunded problem. And you mentioned the federal government is required to protect tribal communities based on the legal doctrine, the trust responsibility, thus a broken trust. And that's rooted in centuries-old treaties between the U.S. government and tribal nations. Now, let's talk about moving forward. The Violence Against Women Act right now, you're going to be hearing that in Congress as they try to put a little more teeth into that act. Is there hope? Is there some light at the end of the tunnel? It's hard to watch this and not have a defeatist attitude when you get done watching it.
I would agree with that.
Okay.
I
It wasn't
think
just
that,
me? Okay.
No, I think that's generally when we would show this to people, they would be like, wow, like what can we possibly do to help with this? Like, do we call someone? What do we do? Unfortunately, because it's such a complex system, it's not going to be solved with one law. So the Violence Against Women Act is a great piece of legislation. It addresses funding for victims, advocates, programs. It also helps with jurisdiction over non-Native perpetrators for specific crimes. So right now it's domestic violence, but the Violence Against Women Act has been stuck in Congress for a while, and because they're arguing over a few things, and tribal jurisdiction is one of those things. But I think that it comes down to a lot of fundamental things. So funding for the courts would be probably very helpful. Just funding for healthcare, funding for education. Housing was a huge issue. Housing has to do with all of those things.
Right.
You know, if you don't have shelter, you know, you're more prone to, you know, be in the streets, be in a more vulnerable position, and not be able to take care of yourself. Like, I think that there are just fundamental things that need to be addressed before you can just go and try to solve, like, just Violence Against Women Act. I don't think will solve everything
It's just one
law.
tool.
Yeah.
The contrast between the Fort Peck community and Fort Berthold is very dramatic in that the Native American tribe of Fort
Berthold.
is, they say, one of the most well-off
Yeah.
Native American tribe because of the oil and gas exploration. You couldn't say that about Fort Peck. The poverty at the Fort Peck area is just startling.
Right. And so that's one of the reasons why we felt it's so very important to like highlight both of these reservations, right? We were very intentional about showing the contrast, right? So you have Fort Peck, who is sort of struggling financially, but yet they've been able to implement some of the things in their judicial and criminal system that would be able to help bring relief to some of the survivors. Then you've got Fort Berthold, 3 hours away, who has a lot of money, one of the richest tribes in the Great Plains, and yet they don't have some of the things in place to be able to protect their citizens with regards to this as well as they probably could. And it was very important for us to kind of show that no matter whether you have a lot of money or a little bit of money, you still have some of the same core problems. You still have women and children and others who are being victimized, and there's still this broken system, whether it starts at the tribal level, whether it starts at the federal level, these systems are not talking. So no matter how much money you have to have the will to change it. You have to have the support to change it, whether that support comes from the tribal level or the federal government. And so it's funny when I think back of like how we sort of try to determine which reservations we were going to focus on. And as we did our reporting and we went to Fort Berthold, it became very obvious and clear to us that these are the two reservations that we needed to focus on to show that every reservation, all 573 federally recognized tribes are very different, but here are two that are so close together and are vastly different in sort of being able to address the problems.
If I could go back to hope real quick.
Quickly.
Yeah,
Very quickly.
Yeah, bring us back to hope.
There are two Native American women who were recently elected to Congress,
I was gonna say, yeah.
Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids. And if you think about just having those voices in the room, the federal government, as we know, is a big factor in this and is determining a lot of things. And so to have these voices in the room, I think there is some hope on the horizon.
And I wanted to add, because in addition to that, that's very important, but to me, the hope lies within the people. And as long as you have people who are willing to fight despite the circumstances, it's a tough film, but to me, it's also a film of hope, because you see these people who have the odds stacked against them in so many ways, but they won't quit. They won't give up. And to me, that's the hope that I don't think will ever die.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. I knew this would fly by.
Yeah.
Angela, Carrie, Marion, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In case you didn't get a chance to see this documentary, it's airing again this coming Saturday at 6 o'clock here on the Montana Television Network. And how else you can see it? Newsy's catchline is "Be informed, not influenced." You can also get it. You can stream it, right?
Yeah, you can stream it on Roku. We have an app on Roku, Fire TV,
And Newsy.com.
Newsy.com. It's also on YouTube. It's everywhere.
So our challenge is to get informed. And thank all of you so much, and
Thank you.
good luck with the screenings coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here on Face the State today. Have a great week.